Hello everybody, it's Hater. Welcome back to another Destiny 2 build video. And last time we were on my Warlock, we talked about how you can use Crown of Tempest to have constant ability energy. This of course was before I discovered the far superior exotic this season, Fallen Sunstar. Its exotic perk, Ionic Conductor, is going to allow ionic traces we create to move faster and grant additional ability energy. Nearby allies also gain ability energy when we collect ionic traces. The problem though now with Crown of Tempest is that Fallen Sunstar literally does what it does, but better. The epitome of I'm you, but better. With the release of Arc 3.0, Bungie made ionic traces universal amongst all three classes, and they mostly function as an extra way to gain ability energy. What we're gonna do in this build today is crank that up to 11 and take full advantage of Fallen Sunstar. With it, we're going to be able to spawn upwards to 4 ionic traces at once, turn any enemy into a lightning rod, synergize with multiple different weapons, and most importantly, have infinite abilities. Before we get into breaking down the build though, if you guys enjoy the video and you want to show some support to the channel, the best way to do so is by giving the video a like and subscribing so you'll never miss out on a brand new build video. It really helps out. To start things off though, for our super of choice, it's mostly preference. If you want to focus down one enemy or champion, especially in higher tier nightfalls, you can use Chaos Reach. Or if you want to double down into even more ad clear, you can run Storm Trance. For our melee ability, Ball Lightning is my personal favorite. It's a ranged melee attack and serves its purpose better than Chain Lightning. The only time I think that it would be better to use Chain Lightning over Ball Lightning is if you're using the aspect Lightning Surge, which I'll go into more depth here shortly. For the grenade, Storm Grenade is in my opinion the best option out of everything else. With the fragment Spark of Magnitude increasing its overall lifetime on screen, we're able to apply Jolt to as many enemies as possible. I will note though, if you enjoy using Pulse Grenades, it is an alternative to Storm Grenades. Now, for the nitty gritty, the aspects, and to start off, we're going to be able to use all 3 of them. The only thing that matters is that 2 of them will be interchangeable depending on what content you bring this build into. For the main aspect, Electrostatic Mind, this is going to be Ionic Trace Spawner number 1. It's going to create an ionic trace whenever we defeat an enemy with arc abilities or that is either affected by Jolt or blinded debuffs. Ionic traces are also going to now make us amplified when we pick them up, meaning we have increased movement speed and weapon handling for a short duration. In higher tier content like raids, nightfalls, or master lost sectors, Arc Soul will be your aspect of choice to pair with Electrostatic Mind. This is going to spawn a mini arc buddy for you and your fire team upon using your rift. Functioning as an automated turret, its purpose is to speed up overall ad clear, break arc shields, and spawn ionic traces because its kills are also considered arc abilities. For lower tier content or mindless ad clear content like strikes, catch crash, or even campaign missions, you can swap Arc Soul out for Lightning Surge. With it, it's going to convert your current melee ability into a large AoE attack if you use it while sliding. This AoE attack also jolts enemies upon arrival. The reason I mentioned earlier why we would use Chain Lightning over Ball Lightning in this situation is because Chain Lightning has a overall shorter cooldown. Since Lightning Surge is going to be our new melee attack and what we want to use over our actual melee attack, a lower cooldown overall is a better option. Next up, moving on to the fragments, starting on the left, Spark of Shock, an essential to all arc builds. It causes our grenades to jolt and chain lightning to nearby enemies. Main purpose, of course, is to act as a catalyst for the build and in the long run spawn more ionic traces because of Electrostatic Mind and other fragments. Speaking of which, for the next fragment, Spark of Ions, this is going to be our ionic trace spawner number 2. With it, jolt kills are now going to also spawn ionic traces. Something you might be asking right now, why are we using Spark of Ions if Electrostatic Mind already spawns ionic traces from jolt kills? And to answer that, Spark of Ions is actually going to stack with it and create an additional ionic trace. Even though it states that both of them spawn traces from jolt kills, there is some form of internal cooldown that stops them from spawning. So all this does is fill in that gap and create more traces overall. One's going to create an ionic trace, and then the other one's going to create one when the other one's down. Moving on to the next fragment, Spark of Magnitude, which we already talked about. All this does is extend the duration of our lightning grenades, pulse grenades, and storm grenades, synergizing with Spark of Shock and inevitably spawning more ionic traces. For the final fragment, Spark of Discharge, this is going to be ionic trace spawner number 3, allowing kills with our arc weapons that we have currently equipped to also create ionic traces periodically. Not only is this going to synergize with the overall build, but it even solves one of the main issues with the build, where if we use all of our abilities, we don't have to rely on cooldowns to get the build back up and running. As for the actual weapons I could recommend to run with this build, of course, it would be wrong not to mention the most popular option this season, the seasonal exotic fusion rifle, Delicate Tomb. Its exotic perk intrinsically synergizes with ionic traces, allowing it to not only create traces on kill, but cause traces you pick up to overcharge its next shot, giving it more damage and the ability to jolt enemies. Bungie seriously knew what they were doing, adding these two exotics into the game at the same time. Of course though, I will mention you can use any kind of arc weapon in this build. Delicate Tomb is just one of the best options and the most obvious options. If you happen to have the seasonal sidearm or the seasonal scout rifle, both of these guns can roll the perk Volt Shot, meaning when you get a kill and reload with the weapon, your next shot is going to jolt enemies, a great option to synergize with the overall build. But let's just say you don't have Delicate Tomb, you don't have any Volt Shot weapons, you could use something like Trinity Ghoul or any arc weapon in general. Trust me, this build is extremely flexible. Finally though, now that we're done talking about the subclass and what weapons you could bring into this build, let's finally move on to the armor. And you guys know, as per usual, you're gonna need a few things. At least 2 armor pieces solar, 2 armor pieces void, and then 1 of your choosing. Starting off over at the helmet, our Fallen Sunstar. We're gonna want this as solar and use the mod Ashes to Assets. All this does, give you more super energy when you get kills with your grenade. Since our grenade is jolting everything and dealing a lot of AoE damage, we might as well gain a bunch of super energy at the same time. Harmonic Siphon is also going to be a great pair for this build since we are using arc weapons to synergize with our build. This is going to make them spawn orbs of power on top of ionic traces and overall give us more ability energy in the long run. For the mod at the very end though, Elemental Ordnance. Defeating a combatant with your grenade spawns an elemental well that matches to your subclass typing. Again, we get kills with our grenades, it creates ionic traces, and it will also create elemental wells for even more energy. With Fallen Sunstar being our main focus for ability energy, elemental wells may seem a bit overkill. So what we'll do instead is focus them around giving us buffs instead of energy. Speaking of which, moving on over to the arms, this is the first armor piece you're going to want as Void. Reason for that, Reaping Wellmaker. After we activate our class ability, our next weapon Final Blow is going to create a Void Elemental Well. This Void Elemental Well is going to be paired with a different mod in the build, which I will get into here very shortly. But as for the other mods in our arms, this is pretty much up to preference. I personally enjoy using Bolstering Detonation with a Focusing Strike. This just gives me more class ability energy whenever I use both my melee and my grenade. In this slot, you're pretty free to put whatever you want. You can put reloader mods or even champion mods, it doesn't really matter. Moving on though, down to the chest piece, this is the second armor piece you're going to want as Void. And we mentioned earlier, Reaping Wellmaker is going to create a Void Elemental Well. The mod at the very end though is the reason why. The biggest flaw that Arc Warlock or any Arc subclass has right now is survivability. And with a Void Well, we can use it as a resource and give ourselves 40% damage resistance for 5 seconds with the mod Well of Tenacity. With Arc Soul equipped and Fallen Sunstar giving us a bunch of ability energy, we should be able to lay rifts pretty consistently and proc Well of Tenacity. As for the other mods we'll be using in this armor piece, you guys already know, we pair a Thermoshock plating with a Void resistance at the same time, and it gives us 25% damage resistance from all 3 elements. Later down the road, of course, when we don't have seasonal artifacts, you can change these out to whatever the current season is providing. All you would have to do is change up your armor energy. Next up, moving on down to the boots. This is the second armor piece you're going to want as solar. Reason for that, recuperation and innervation. Both of these are going to take advantage of our harmonic siphon that we have in our helmet and give us health and grenade energy whenever we pick up orbs of power. It's a little extra bonus, but we might as well use it. For the mod at the very end though, Fonts of Might. Picking up a arc elemental well, since we are using a arc subclass, is going to give our arc weapons 25% more damage for 10 seconds. Like I said earlier, we're only going to be using our wells in this build for extra buffs, and Fonts of Might is the second buff that will pair along with the build. Since we want to use arc weapons to spawn ionic traces, we might as well increase their damage at the same time. This will also perfectly synergize with any buffs that are in our fire team. Well of Radiance, Divinity, you name it, it will stack. Finally though, moving down to the class item, this is the armor piece that you could have as any energy of your choosing, and is probably the most flexible armor piece in the entire build. You can put literally whatever you want here. What I like to use is an elemental armament, so our arc weapons will also create arc elemental wells. This is mainly so I don't have to rely on my grenade only to create my arc well, and then use the new artifact mod Trace Evidence. If you guys happen to have this, this will be your Ionic Trace spawner number 4. Defeating combatants affected by any arc debuff will also spawn an Ionic Trace. If they're jolted, if they're blinded, it doesn't matter, you get another Ionic Trace, feeding more into Fallen Sunstar. Then of course, with the extra slot that I have, I decided to put a bad amplitude. This is just bonus, you don't really have to do this. It just helps me jolt champions whenever I hit them with an arc ability. This is mostly just going to improve my arc soul or my melee attack when I bring this into Nightfalls or anything with champions. Overall though guys, that is going to be the build for today's video. I absolutely adore Fallen Sunstar, and this is one of my favorite exotics in the entire game right now. You get so much ability energy, it's almost not fair. As always, if you guys have any questions, feel free to leave them down in the comments, or you can come ask me in person over at my Twitch where I stream Destiny 2. Overall though, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I'm going to catch you in the next one. Bye bye.